All right. Like I said, garden pests and diseases. We're going to focus a lot on vegetable garden pests and diseases. And I hope you're seeing my screen full screen. If not, somebody feel free to stop me, but I think I'm sharing correctly. Like I said, mostly vegetable pests and diseases. I do have some pests and diseases of ornamental types of flowers, just really common things that you might see on your flowers and stuff like that. But a lot of the questions we get are about vegetable pests and diseases. So that's mostly what we're going to be sticking with today. Generally, our outline of discussion is we're going to talk a little bit about integrated pest management, or IPM is how we abbreviate that. And that's kind of just an approach to pest management and how you should most responsibly approach pest management in your own garden so that you're effective but also environmentally friendly. And then we'll go into the pests. We got a lot of pests to talk about, and then we'll also talk about a few diseases after that. And we'll go over management strategies, signs and symptoms, what they look like, all of the stuff you'll need to know. So let's dig right into integrated pest management, IPM. Like I said, this is more of an approach and ideology of how to approach pest management, and it's multi-pronged. So we'll kind of go over the different prongs and in which order you should consider these prongs. There's a variety of management strategies really to deal with any pest or disease. There's a lot of options that you have, and it's good to kind of start with the least harmful or invasive options and then work your way down from there until you find what's going to work for you with the least amount of input from you. We'll talk about things like cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical methods, and we'll go over some examples of what those mean here in just a second, but those are just examples of the kind of prongs included in the IPM approach. So when we're practicing integrated pest management, or IPM, the main objective here is to obviously minimize damage from the pest or disease and maximize profitability. So that's more, if you're growing plants for profit, but also the profitability just to how much of a harvest you get. And of course, just the aesthetics. You're growing these plants because you like them and you want them to be beautiful. So we want to minimize the pests, minimize damage to the environment, maximize what we get out of the plants. So here are some examples of techniques that we're going to talk about when it comes to integrated pest management. And these are in order of things you would want to try first, and then the things that would be your last resort at the bottom here. So number one would be plant selection. Some plants are just super susceptible to a certain insect or disease in our area, but there may be a certain variety or cultivar that's not as susceptible. So learning about that beforehand, and sometimes that takes some trial and error. You've planted a certain variety a few years in a row, you've had the same problem. So then you start to look into some resistant varieties. So knowing about those resistant varieties ahead of time, choosing the correct plants for our area that are going to be resistant, that's step one. And sometimes that's something we look at kind of after the fact that we see a problem, but we're able to adjust in the future and look for those resistant plants. Second would be soil management. So this could be a lot of things, whether it's you have, an insect or disease that's kind of soil borne or overwintering in the soil. So you might practice crop management. You might need to keep your soil moisture more even or consistent. Mulching is kind of a type of soil management. So there's lots of things that we could do with our soil that aren't so much doing with the plant, but more dealing with the soil to control whatever is affecting our plant. Water management is a huge one. Almost all of the diseases that we're going to talk about today have a lot to do with water management and the fact that we might be overhead watering, whereas, drip irrigation or watering at the roots would probably cut down on some of those diseases. So how we water, when we water, consistency of watering our plants, these are all things that could definitely help with pests and diseases and something that should be considered when we're having an issue. Cultural care kind of is a little more broad, but, these are things like where we place the plants, or maybe how we're pruning them, or it really could be how we're watering them or fertilizing them, things that we're kind of doing to the plants when it comes to their care that we might be able to change to help prevent an issue that we're seeing with them. Weather influence. Now, obviously, there's not a lot we can do about the weather, but we can learn how the weather influences some of our pests and diseases, how it makes them worse, and maybe think of things that we can do to mitigate that. Maybe it's shade cloth, maybe it's frost protection, things like that. We can't control the weather, obviously, but there are things we can do to kind of fight back against it and make it work in our favor. Mechanical methods, so that a lot of these insects are big and obvious, and just picking them off the plant is a good mechanical, chemical free way to get rid of them. And I'll tell you about the ones that works best for. After that, we would look into things like bio-natural. So these are natural products that are maybe natural enemies of the pest in question. Maybe a nematode or a protozoa or something that affects that pest specifically, something very natural that would target exactly what we're dealing with, and it's not as chemically harmful. And then last resort is going to be our pesticides. Sometimes it may be necessary. It kind of depends on your views and what you want to do in your garden. Of course, there's organic types of pesticides, and there are more conventional types of pesticides. Just because something is more labeled as more natural or more organic, you still always need to read the label. Even if you kind of generally know about the product or the ingredient you're getting, you should always check out the label of the specific products and make sure that you're following all of their guidance, any kind of warnings, all of the instructions. Of course, make sure the plant that you want to use it on is listed on the label, and the pest that you have is listed on the label. These are all things that you should consider. And then, pesticides can be used safely, and they should be a last resort, but just if you're going to use them, just make sure you're using them correctly. So before you dig in and start really trying to control things going on in your garden, you need to ask yourself a few questions. Number one, what is the plant? We probably know most of the time, oh, these beetles are eating my cabbage or something like that. But figuring out the plant is step one, because that will help us narrow down what the insect or what the disease might be once we know for sure what the plant is. So that's your step one. And then once you know the plant, then we can ask ourselves, what is this disease or what is this pest? And hopefully this presentation will help you to recognize some of these really common things that we see in our gardens. Or else the extension office, that's what we're here for. You can email, you can call, you can send us pictures. We have a Master Gardener helpline, which I can type the information for that in the chat after the class. But if you're unsure and you have something going on, you need to figure out what it is so that you can figure out the right management protocols. Next is, what type of damage is it causing? That will help us figure out what's going on as well. If we know, okay, it's chewing the leaves, or I'm seeing spotting on my leaves, or my fruit has distortions going on. So we need to know what kind of damage is being caused. And then we really need to sit back and ask ourselves, are management efforts warranted? Once we know what kind of damage is being caused, what's the disease or pest that's causing it, do we need to do anything about it? Or can we maybe let natural enemies that are present in the garden as well take their course and jump in and help us out without us really having to do much of anything? So that's something that we'll talk about with a few of these too, how sometimes it's maybe better to just kind of let it go if they're not necessarily going to kill your plant, and it might take care of itself in the end. And of course, if management efforts are warranted, we don't want to lose a plant or anything like that, then what are the management efforts? What are all of your options to handle this problem? And what is the best kind of timing to do these different management efforts? We're going to jump into pests first, and I'm just going to take a quick peek at the chat. Looks like everybody is on board with IPM so far. So I will continue on, and we will get into some really common pests that we see around the Pueblo area. Number one here is aphids. Aphids are pretty common on a lot of different types of plants. There's a ton of different kinds of aphids. You might see them on trees. You definitely see them on a lot of different kinds of plants in the vegetable garden. Some ornamentals. Aphids are all over. There's giant conifer aphids that have these creepy large legs that you might find on your pine trees. So lots of different kinds, but generally they are all the same as far as the damage they're causing. They tend to remove large quantities of sap. They have these piercing mouth parts that they pierce into our plants. They remove large quantities of sap or fluid from the plant, which is going to reduce growth and just the overall vigor of the plant. So you'll probably see them a lot of times when you start to get an aphid outbreak. There's a bunch of them. So you'll probably see these little things, and there's lots of different kinds. They could be green, black, yellow, orange, clear even, but you'll probably notice them. You might also notice leaf curling, especially on some different trees. If your leaves are curling and you uncurl them, you might see aphids inside of the curl. If you see a lot of ants on a plant, then that might be a sign that aphids are also present, because they're kind of going after some of that sweet sap that the aphids are sucking out. And you might actually see that sweet honeydew-like substance that they are pulling out of the plant present on leaves, or even falling, from a tree onto your car or something like that. Now, the good thing with aphids is they're these really quite weak, soft-bodied insects, and they have a ton of natural enemies. They're not tough at all when it comes to the insect world. Lots and lots of other insects out there will eat them and will handle this problem for you. So this is one where if you see a ton of aphids on a plant, you might want to give it a little bit of time and see if just these natural enemies might take care of it. For example, ladybug nymphs, the little baby ladybugs that don't really look like ladybugs at all, they will definitely eat a ton of aphids. Lots and lots of different insects will. So if you see ladybugs in the garden, it's a good sign that your aphid problem is soon going to be over. So this is one that I would say, sit back, wait a minute, see if nature can take its course and help you out with these aphids. If not, though, like I said, they're really weak and easy to control. I would start out with just a high pressure blast of water. Bring your hose out, put the jet on, and just wash that plant off. And that's probably going to kill the majority of them. And who doesn't get killed, they're not going to make it back onto your plant because they're just so tiny and weak, they're not going to be able to. So rinsing them off is a really good option. That's where I would start. If that doesn't really work, you can try insecticidal soaps. Those are available at any garden center. Read the instructions, of course, but that's a pretty natural product that you can use that should work on aphids. If you did need to really resort to a pesticide because it's just totally out of control and you're worried about losing a really good plant, here's your list of ingredients. Now, I'm going to give you ingredients most of the time, not brand names of products. So you're going to need to check out the labels and find these ingredients listed on the labels. You're going to want to look for acephate, bifenthrin, and imidacloprid. Those are the ones that have been known to be effective. And again, just make sure you followed all the instructions and warning guidance on the label if you were to use any of those. Next is flea beetles, another very common plant, particularly in the vegetable garden. You might see flea beetles on your tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplant, cabbage, broccoli, beans, radishes, beets, lettuce. They really will go for just about anything. They're not too picky, and they can do quite a bit of damage. As you can see in this photo here, they eat holes right through the leaves. This definitely reduces plant growth, and these ones can actually kill your plant if they're there in high enough numbers. They're very small. These pictures are pretty zoomed in, but they're very tiny. They'll just look like these tiny little black shiny bugs, and they jump when you disturb them. So if you were to, touch the plant or something like that, you'll see them all jumping around. So things you can do ahead of time to prevent flea beetles if you've had problems in the past is to use good, healthy transplants. If you're planting from transplants in the vegetable garden, make sure you get them so they're nice and healthy before you put them in the ground. And once you get them in there, encourage rapid establishment. So, you know, get them watered, get them fertilized after you get them planted, help them to get established so that if they do get flea beetles, they can overcome that. You can also try floating row covers. These are just a kind of a cover that will still let light in, and there's different kinds that will let more or less light in. You'll have to have some kind of frame, or if you have like a little hoop house or something like that, to hold the floating row covers over them. But that tends to kind of keep the flea beetles off of the plants a little bit. And then, of course, if you need to resort to pesticides, you can use carbaryl. Here's an example where I do have a brand name. You may have heard of 7. That's the active ingredient is carbaryl. Spinosad, bifenthrin, or permethrin are the ingredients you would want to look for flea beetles. And again, for those just joining us, you will get the slides and handouts. So you don't need to write down all of these ingredients. Maybe just in the email you get, save that. If you run across any of these problems, you can look and see which ingredients or which management strategies we recommended for certain problems. All right, next is squash bugs. So just like the name implies, they definitely feed on squash, but also closely related plants like pumpkins, gourds, and melons. Symptoms you might see are the vines wilting and your leaves turning black. And the bugs are pretty large, so you should probably see them. They're kind of creepy looking when they're young. They're green or red. When they get older, they're kind of a grayish white color. And on the underside of the leaves is where you'll see their eggs. And that's what this top picture is. So it's good to inspect your squash, pumpkin, gourds, and melons. Check out under their leaves. If you do see a little mass of eggs like this, go ahead and crush them. Get ahead of the problem so that they don't hatch and then start to feed on your plants. If you do end up with the squash bug problem, though, fall garden cleanup is really going to be critical so you don't end up with the problem next year. You're going to want to pull those plants out, dispose of them, clean up any parts that have fallen, and that'll make it less likely that any squash bugs are going to be able to overwinter in your garden. Usually, I'm always a huge fan of mulch in all types of situations, including the vegetable garden. But if you have an area where you just keep having these squash bug problems, that is one of the only times I might suggest to skip mulch, to pull the mulch back from around those plants, because the squash bugs can tend to kind of hide in there and shelter in there. So if you pull it back, they'll be a little bit more exposed and won't really have anywhere to hide. And that can kind of help you to get ahead of the problem. They're, like I said, they're pretty large bugs. So if you can hand pick these ones for sure. Hand pick them off your plants, hand pick them off from the soil around. That will definitely help. And I already mentioned just crushing those eggs if you see them on the underside of your leaves, or just remove the leaf that has the eggs on it if you can afford to, if you have a nice vibrant plant. Diatomaceous earth is something you can try. That's a product that you would put around the base of the plant, sprinkle around the base of the plant. And what it does is it kind of cuts the bugs. And when it cuts them, it makes it so they are losing too much water essentially, and they'll die. So it's not really like a pesticide, but it still is effective to help kill those bugs. Pyrethrin is another product you can use to apply at the base of the plant. Also, here's the list of ingredients that you can use for products that you would spray on and around the plant as well. Permethrin, carbaryl, that 7 again is kind of a multitasker when it comes to the vegetable garden. So worst case scenario, those are the kind of products you'd want to look for. Grasshoppers. This is a really hard one. In some years we have big problems with grasshoppers. So that's a bummer. The good thing is they're kind of cyclical. So we'll have bad years and we'll have good years. Hopefully this year we don't have many grasshoppers. They tend to lay fewer eggs when the weather is cooler and wetter. So some lay their eggs in the fall, and remembering back to the fall, I don't know at this point. I can't remember if it was cool and wet, but if it was, then they might have laid less eggs, and it's definitely been pretty cool and wet this spring. So that's a good sign. But they eat everything. They eat a variety of plants, shrubs, trees, really anything they could get their little jaws on. I found this statistic that I thought was pretty mind-blowing. And if you've had grasshopper problems in your garden, then I bet you'll believe it, that 7 grasshoppers per square yard spread over 10 acres eat the same rations as one cow, one whole cow. So they really can do some big damage. They do have some natural enemies, definitely. Birds, rodents, spiders, skunks, flies, horsehair worms. These are all enemies of grasshoppers. So, if you can maybe put out a bird feeder and see if some birds would like to come eat the grasshoppers in your gardens. If you have chickens, maybe let them peck around in the garden. Insecticides are hard. Control on a grasshopper is hard because they're super mobile. They can fly around all over the place. So even if you're doing something to control them in your garden, they can still come from, your neighbor's garden or even miles and miles away. So control gets really hard, but Carbaryl 7 tends to be effective. They make it, of course, as a spray, but then they also make a bait, which works well. So it's like a grain or a wheat product that has the insecticide on it that attracts the grasshoppers. They eat the product and then ingest the insecticide that way. So baits can usually be pretty effective. All of these control options work better when the grasshoppers are small. So if you start to see the little ones, start thinking right then about what you're going to do about it, because they're much easier to control when they're young. Malathion is another spray that you can work. And then, that could work. And then they make a couple baits that have this protozoa, I believe, Nosema locustae, that only affects the grasshoppers. It's not going to affect anything else, but it's a bait. So, a grain or wheat product covered in the Nosema locustae, and the grasshoppers will eat it, and it basically prevents their ability to grow, and they end up, dying from that. So they make a couple different brands of this bait. Nolo bait is one, Nolo. I believe the other one is called Semaspore. They might be a little bit hard to find. I know there was some problems with manufacturing in the past, but I think that those have all been taken care of, so you should be able to find it. But those baits tend to work well when the grasshoppers are small and young. So if you can get your hands on those, that is a very good option and a very environmentally friendly option. And someone once asked me, well, what if a bird ate the grasshopper that had eaten the Nolo bait, or, the Semaspore? And this specific natural enemy of the grasshopper is fine for birds. So it wouldn't hurt the bird at all. So it's really a good thing to do if you just really want to target the grasshoppers only. All right, Japanese beetles. If you are a resident of Pueblo, I'm sure that you've probably seen these around if you have certain plants in your yard, particularly Virginia creeper. They love roses, raspberries, grapes, green beans, really anything in the rose family. So if you have like crab apple trees or something like that, you might see them there. And they really like those plants that they prefer. They'll be all over them. You'll see them. And the problem with the Japanese beetles is the larvae and the adults are damaging. The larvae are a species of grub, like white grub in your lawn, that can harm your lawn. And then the adult damages all those plants that I just recommended. I'm not going to get super into the grubs in the lawn. I think next month in June, our yard and garden class is on lawn care, so I'll probably cover them there. So I'm going to stick mostly with the adults here. This is what they look like. They're kind of neat looking, shiny little bugs, but boy, do they do a lot of damage. You'll see traps advertised at they have them at garden stores. We don't recommend the traps. They do trap them. They trap a lot of them, but they have an attractant in them, And research has been showing that those traps actually bring more into the area than they actually trap. So you're actually doing yourself a bit of a disservice by having those traps because you're just bringing more of them in. This is another one that hand picking works really well. So if you have a plant that's covered in Japanese beetles and you can go out early in the morning and hand pick them, or even better, just shake the plant into a bucket of like soapy water, that really helps with these, because as they feed, they release a pheromone or like a signal to the other Japanese beetles in the area saying, hey, here's a really good plant over here that you should come and feed on. So if you're able to get rid of a bunch of them by shaking them off your plant, that will actually really help you get ahead of the problem, because they will stop sending out that signal and kind of calling to all their friends to come to your plant. So that's really a good thing to do if you're able to get out there and do that. Now, another really tricky thing with the Japanese beetle is that they feed at the same time that these plants are flowering. So there's a lot of products that are not safe to use, because if you use them when a plant is flowering, you'll be harming bees, pollinators that are visiting that plant. So you have to be really, really careful with what you use, timing, and just really be careful on reading the labels here. This list right here, carbaryl, bifenthrin, so on, permethrin, and imidacloprid, these cannot be used when the plant is in flower at all. And this states that on the label, that you cannot use this product on a flowering plant because of pollinator concerns. Things like pyrethrins, azadirachtin, and acetamiprid, they can be used during certain times of the day and certain times of the plant's life cycle. So you just really need to read the label of the product you get and make sure you're following those instructions so that you don't accidentally harm any bees. Bacillus thuringiensis is a strain of bacteria that is fatal to the Japanese beetle. And not even going to try to pronounce that chemical name, but one of the name brands you might find is acyloprin. These ones are more safe to use when it comes to the pollinator issue. The Bacillus thuringiensis is, specific to the Japanese beetle, so it's probably one of the safer things to use. So you want to ideally look for those two, and of course, always, even if you get those, still read the label and use them properly. But that is a concern that you'll definitely want to be aware of if you do choose to use pesticides to control Japanese beetles. False cinch bugs. These are relatively uncommon, but in the last few years, we have been seeing them a little bit, so I decided to throw them in. They kind of look like a squash bug, a kind of long-legged, gross-looking bug. And you'll find them in your vegetable garden on things like your radishes, if you grow canola, mustard greens. You might also see it on potato, lettuce, quinoa. You might even see it in your turf. And then it might be on weeds as well, such as kochia and pigweed. So if you have kochia and pigweed growing and the false cinch bugs are on them, they could spread to your vegetable garden. Or your turf. So that's something to be aware of. If you have, one or two, it's not that big of a deal, but as you can see in this picture on the right, they'll aggregate, and that's when they can cause some pretty good damage. Usually bumping up the irrigation will suppress them. That usually works. Wash them off, bump up the irrigation, particularly in your turf. Really only need to use chemicals on these. Sometimes if it's an agricultural setting, sometimes farmers might want to use chemicals, but in a home garden situation, it's usually not necessary. They're short-lived, easily handled by increasing the water. So probably not a whole lot you really need to do, but just to be aware of what you're seeing. Spotted cucumber beetle, kind of a cool looking little bug, but obviously, as the name implies, problems on cucumbers, also cantaloupes, beans, and corn. It will feed on some of your ornamental flowers if their populations are really high and they run out of food in your vegetable garden. Again, floating row covers can help. This is an insect where mulch will actually help. Kind of covering up any bare soil will prevent them from laying eggs. So kind of prevent the problem from spreading into the future. Thorough cleanup is critical. So this is one, if you have this problem in your garden, you're going to want to make sure to do a really good fall cleanup, pick up any fallen parts, dispose of the plants properly. Probably don't compost them, just go ahead and throw them away. That should help you from spreading the problem into future years. Crop rotation, it's always good. And then if needed, here's your list of insecticides. Carbaryl is on there for almost all of them. And then there's a few more that you could use and look for at the garden center if needed. Harlequin bugs, very cool looking, and the eggs are super cool looking. That's that top picture, very easy to spot. You might see harlequin bugs on your cabbage, broccoli, horseradish, cauliflower, collards, mustard, turnip, radish cress, so things in that kind of general family. And these ones they lay their eggs 3 times a year. So it's kind of, you got to stay on top of checking for these eggs underneath the leaves. And the picture, as you can see, they're pretty obvious and pretty cool looking little eggs, but you can hand pick the eggs and destroy them. You can definitely hand pick the adults if you see them. There's a picture on the right there of an adult. Clean up any debris, and then the pyrethroid insecticide, so permethrin, is what you would want to look for if you really just can't get a handle on them. Tomato hornworm, mostly tomatoes, obviously, but you also might see this on your peppers or your potatoes. It's a big, gigantic green caterpillar, really hard to miss, although it does tend to blend in with the stems sometimes, so it might be a little bit hard to miss, but you'll notice once you see just your plants being totally defoliated. Caterpillars can be so damaging and just totally eat the leaves. They'll also chew through the fruits. So you might see your tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes getting chewed through. And they'll lay large pearl-colored eggs on actually the upper sides of the leaves, whereas most of the insects we talked about so far laid their eggs on the bottom of the leaves. These will be on the top surface of the leaves. You can mostly find these caterpillars actively feeding near dusk and dawn, so that would be a good time to get out there and hand pick them. They're, like I said, they're big, so that'll be easy to pick them right off. Bacillus thuringiensis there's another strain that's specifically made for these types of caterpillars that you could use as a biological control. That would be a very safe thing to use. And of course, carbaryl, permethrin, and spinosad would be your more conventional pesticide options. And the right picture on the right is the kind of moth that the tomato hornworm turns into, in case you're curious. Here's one that is a pest of an ornamental for the first time, I believe. Well, we had the Japanese beetle, but this is the tobacco or the geranium budworm. Probably more people are growing geraniums than tobacco, I would think. So that's what they tend to be a serious pest of, geraniums, petunias, other kinds of garden flowers like that. The first thing you might probably observe is just a lack of flowering. Like, why am I not getting any flowers here? And then you look a little deeper and notice that you have these little caterpillars feeding on the buds, and that's why they're not coming out and flowering. They can be red, green, or brown. They kind of have stripes. This picture didn't come out quite as clear as it looked on my computer before, but you can kind of get a feel for their size. That's the little bud of a flower there, and then the caterpillar entering it. Any flowers that show damage, go ahead and just hand pick those off. That's something you can do. They tend to live in the soil, lay their eggs in the soil. So if it's a real problem, you might repot and remove the soil, kind of like shake it all off the roots, wash it off, and repot with new soil. That could be helpful. Also, if you have had problems and you still really want to grow geraniums, ivy geraniums are more resistant to the budworm. So that would be something to try. And there's the little moth that it grows into after it eats all of your geraniums. All right, spider mites are very small, so they will be hard to see. That's a very, very magnified photo of one. It's smaller than the head of a pin. So small that you might only see the webbing or the speckling on your leaves, like you see in this photo here. On conifer trees, it may be more of a fading, a general fading of color along with some webbing. They do have a lot of predators, ladybugs, pirate bugs. There's other kinds of mites that will feed on spider mites. So sometimes they will take care of the problem for you. Mostly we're going to see these spider mites showing up during dry times. Plants that are drought stressed, plants that aren't getting enough water. They're going to be the most likely to succumb to spider mite damage. You can, just like with the aphids, hose them off. They're, pretty weak and soft bodied. So hosing them off with a forceful jet of water, cleaning off all the webs, that is usually a pretty good way to go. Horticultural oils are kind of a general product that you can buy at the garden center that is pretty safe that you can use. And of course, just read the label still. And then bifenthrin is really the only chemical control that research has found to be effective. So if you really just can't get a handle on them, you'll want to look for an ingredient of bifenthrin. Spinach Leafminer. You may have seen this on your spinach plants before. It's kind of these spots that are kind of clear, but they're not holes. They still have tissue, but it just turns kind of clear. So this little insect leaves these large clear blotches on spinach, beets, and some different weeds like lamb's quarter, if you have that in your yard. Mostly we see this where people overwinter things like spinach or beets. You have a picture of the eggs. They're really tiny and they lay them in this little row down here. If you see that, destroy them, pick them off. Any leaves showing damage, go ahead and just pick them off and throw them away. Don't put them in your compost. That usually will solve the problem. There's not a whole lot of products you can use on this because the actual leaf miner is in between those blotches, so it's inside of the leaf. So even if you were to spray it with something, it's not going to contact the insect because they're kind of protected inside of the leaf there. So not a whole lot of insecticide options, mostly just kind of cultural mechanical things that we could do. All right, I am going to give you guys a second to mull that over and type anything in the chat before we start on diseases. And I don't really see anything coming in the chat yet, and that's okay. If something comes to your mind, feel free to type it in. I will continue on with diseases, and we'll have time at the end for questions as well. So, all right, so let's start with powdery mildew, a very common one that you might see in your garden. You'll probably see it on like your squash, cucumbers, melons, things like that. Also ash trees, lilacs get it a lot, grapes, your roses, sometimes your turf grass, different fruit trees, and your Virginia creeper. You might see this on. The leaves are going to appear white and kind of dusty. You'll typically see it more mid to late summer. The best thing you can do is increase air circulation if you need to prune stuff back in your garden, to just let a little more air flow through, and then definitely avoid overhead watering. If you have maybe like sprinklers or something hitting your plants, that's probably contributing to the problem. So you want to concentrate the watering right at the roots, or ideally use drip irrigation. If not, just get your watering can down there at the base of the plant rather than wetting the leaves. That should help as well. You can use products with sulfur, neem oil, triferine, or potassium bicarbonate. Those are all ingredients that could work. Horticultural oils could work. You can, if it's not too bad, to just start out with a few leaves, definitely pick them off and don't compost them. You want to just throw them away. Really, with any kind of diseased plant, it's best to just throw it away, because you have to really count on your compost getting pretty hot to destroy a lot of organisms, and it's probably a safer bet just to dispose of it. Early blight is common on tomatoes. You will see brown to black spots on the older leaves of your tomatoes. It can start to move to the stems and even to the fruit with those kind of brown black blotches. And then if any leaves fall off, pick them up immediately. You want to do some good hygiene, remove the leaves, don't let them sit around. The next coming year, you're not going to want to plant your tomatoes in the same place. You're going to want to change up where you planted them. Just like with powdery mildew, increase your air circulation, avoid any kind of overhead watering. And then you can use a sulfur dust, which you can buy at a garden center to help control this one. Cucumber mosaic virus, obviously find it on cucumbers, but it can also spread to tomatoes, spinach, celery, beans, peppers, beets, potatoes, lots of different ornamentals and weeds. So this one definitely can spread. You'll start to see the veins of the leaves clearing, becoming a little bit clearer, and some yellow mottling, which I have a couple pictures of here. The fruit can also tend to be distorted if it gets to an advanced level. So there's really not a whole lot you can do about this one. If you start to see this going on, it's best to just remove and destroy the plants right away because as you can see, it spreads to like almost everything. So you'll just want to lose the plant. Just risk the plant so you don't lose anything else and just throw it in the trash. Blossom end rot is something we typically mostly think of on tomatoes, but we also might see it on pepper, squash, eggplants, watermelons, and we'll see this leathery black-brown lesion on the blossom end of the fruit. So kind of the bottom end where the blossom originally was. And the cause of blossom end rot is because calcium is unavailable to the plant. Now, that does not mean that your soil is lacking in calcium or that you should get a calcium supplement and put it into your garden. It just means that for a different reason, the plant is not able to take up that calcium. And a lot of times, just because a nutrient is present, the environment has to be correct for the plant to actually be able to use that out of the soil. So the root cause when we see this is usually caused by either extreme hot or cold temperatures combined with moisture fluctuation. So inconsistent watering. The best thing you can do is stabilize your moisture levels by using mulch all around them so that your soil stays moist for longer, and try to be really consistent with your watering. If you've been inconsistent, you forgot a couple days and then you went out and gave it a ton of water, that can contribute. So try to just get on a good schedule, lay down some mulch, and that should help with blossom end rot. And like I said, you don't want to go out and just put an excessive amount of fertilizer because you have blossom end rot. It's better to just stabilize that soil moisture so that the plants will be able to actually uptake the calcium that's probably already there. This is Hollyhock Rust, something you might see on your hollyhocks, obviously. It's rarely fatal, but it's just kind of ugly. You'll see it in spring and fall, so kind of the ends of the seasons there. There's these little orange, yellow pustules on the bottom of the leaves and then spots on top. If you see the leaf starting to come down with this on your hollyhock, just go ahead and remove it and destroy it. After they bloom, you can go ahead and remove the infected plants so that it doesn't keep spreading year after year. Avoid overcrowding, avoid overhead watering. That's just a good rule for most diseases that we see in the garden. Sulfur can help, as well as these other two insecticides here that you will have in the slides when I send them to you. Leaf scorch is not so much a disease, but something that we see a lot around here. So I wanted to bring it up, and it can be on pretty much any plant. And you'll start to see these really uniform leaf margins turning like dry and brown, if not even black or even like red sometimes. And you can see in the photos, it's very uniform. Like all of these leaves have this same exact pattern going on. And you've probably seen this on trees around. If you pay attention and take a look around at trees around you, you probably will see this. And it's caused by plants that aren't taking up enough water. Sometimes this means that they aren't getting enough water, or sometimes it means it's too hot and they're not getting enough water because they're just, transpiring all of the water out from their leaves. But it can also be caused by an inadequate root system. So maybe you're watering plenty, but you have something going on with the roots. Maybe on a tree you have some girdling roots, so they're just not working good enough to give the plant as much water as it needs, and then we'll start to see leaf scorch. The leaves that have already turned brown won't turn green again, but the plant can absolutely recover. Bumping up the irrigation is good. If you have root issues, sometimes there's not a lot you can do about it, but just providing supplemental irrigation just to try to make that plant be able to take up as much water as it needs. Winter watering, fall and winter watering is a great idea for trees in general. But if you have a tree with leaf scorch, it's an even better idea to get out there in the fall and the winter with your hose or a bucket or whatever you're able to do, and give your trees, all of your perennials really, some water during the fall and winter. You'll really start to see them improving come the next season. And you want to water deeply and infrequently, which doesn't give you a really good idea of how to water, but it's hard to say because how much to water a certain tree really depends on where it is, what kind of tree it is, the soil, the exposure. Is it very hot? But, you want to stick your finger down and you want it to be moist for the first 6 inches to foot or so. And so, get a screwdriver or something, stick it down there and do some investigating. And then you'll be able to figure out how often do I need to water to get that to stay moist, and how much do I need to apply to get it to go that deep. So it just kind of takes getting to know your plant and your environment. Slime mold. This isn't like a harmful thing at all, but I've gotten some calls about it in recent years and it's super interesting. So I thought I would throw it in here in case you end up seeing it at your home, and then you'll know what it is. You'll just suddenly see this foamy patch, either on your turf, or what we often see it on is freshly laid wood mulch, like freshly ground wood mulch. So if it's been really wet or humid, or you just ground that mulch and laid it down, that's when you might see this slime mold appear. The color varies. It could be like white, brown, yellow. It definitely kind of varies. It doesn't cause any kind of disease. If it is on your turf, it can cause it to yellow where it actually lies, just because of the lack of sunlight that it's causing in that area. But if you see it on your mulch and it's kind of unsightly, obviously it doesn't look great. So you can rake the mulch just to kind of get some air circulation. If you're having like your sprinklers hitting the mulch, you can reduce that down a little bit. Just squirt it off of your turf with water, and it doesn't really cause any harm. But it's just something that I wanted to throw in case you do see it. It's kind of alarming. Like, what is this popping up in my yard? But it's not harmful, just kind of a crazy thing that pops up here and there. Red Stele Root Rot. This is a strawberry issue, a springtime issue. So you may have already been seeing it if you have strawberries. It's a fungal disease, common in heavy wet soils, which is why I threw it in here, because a lot of our soils tend to be pretty heavy and pretty clay-like, and those soils tend to stay really wet if they do get a lot of moisture. So this is something we might be dealing with here. Your strawberry plants may appear stunted and kind of matte, they don't have that like glisten like the leaves normally do. The younger leaves may come out almost metallic looking. And if you pull the plant and cut the root in half, you'll see that the center part of the root is like a rusty red brown kind of color rather than a nice healthy white color. So there are varieties that are resistant. If this is something you've had a problem with, I would look into that, which varieties are resistant, and get those. If you have new plants, just check that they look nice and healthy. if you're able to amend your soil in future years with, you know, organic matter, some nice plant-based compost, that should help you increase the drainage in your soil so that it doesn't become as much of a problem. And you can also dip your new plants before you plant them in aluminum trace, or that could be a spray as well, or you could just dip the roots and then plant them if it's really a problem that you're concerned about. This is rose mosaic virus. Typically affects grafted roses. The leaves are going to be kind of mottled with yellow. And the plants that have rose mosaic virus may be more sensitive to winter injuries. So that's something to just kind of look out for. Make sure you lay down some mulch to just protect them a little bit more. You can buy virus-free stock. Look for that at your nursery. Ask your nursery workers if it's virus-free stock. You know, there's not a lot that you can do about it. So if you really are not into the way this looks, you're going to probably just have to remove the infected plant so it doesn't spread. But there really isn't that much of an effect on flowering. And I mean, in my opinion, it kind of looks a little bit cool. So a lot of people choose to ignore it, and that's fine. If you don't mind your leaves looking a little bit mottled, you're still going to get roses, and it shouldn't overall kill your plant. So it's not really anything you need to have a lot of concern about. But, you know, if you really don't want it to spread, then just go ahead and remove your infected plant. All right. I'm going to check the chat and get those questions answered because they may be helpful to you. And then I will start a quick 2-question poll. This is my email address in the meantime. Feel free to shoot me an email anytime. Carolyn, if you're still on, would you please type the Master Gardener email in the chat? And then please feel free to email the Master Gardeners too. Let's see. Something eating my baby transplants down to the nub, but have not found any creatures. Well, it could be damping off, which is a fungal problem. And it tends to affect little tiny transplants and kind of just kill them right down. Damping off, there's not a whole lot you can do about, except for kind of just keep them so they're not super soggy. I know you got to keep them kind of moist because they're new, but to kind of cut back a little bit on that. But if you're not seeing any signs of creatures at all, any insects or anything like that, that would be my only guess. I'm wondering if you want to elaborate a little bit if they are inside or outside. From Michael, Blossom End Rot. Many people recommend adding Tums to the soil for this problem. I tried telling them to water. Yeah, I get that. I get that one a lot, Michael. I hadn't heard the Tums thing. I could see the thinking behind it, that would add calcium to the soil, but no, because even if they're still watering inconsistently, the plants aren't going to be able to take up that calcium, and calcium is usually plentiful in the soil. So yeah, you're right on. They just need to water more consistently, and that's what we would tell them here at the extension office too. So the research is on your side with that one. And thank you so much, Carolyn, for typing in the chat the Pueblo Master Gardener email. They're checking that email a lot. You know, John, I did not talk about cutworms. If that's something that you're having some problems with, please shoot me an email and let's talk about what we can do. I would love to talk more about that with you. And Joanne, okay, they're outside. So, oh boy, yeah, it could be a lot of things. Maybe it's a creature that's active during dusk or dawn and you're not really seeing it. Yeah, I would monitor them a little bit more carefully. Maybe try to start some stuff inside. It's getting a little bit late to be starting seeds inside, but in the future, that might be something to consider. And feel free to keep typing questions in, but I'm going to launch this poll really quick in case anybody would like to get off of the call. And if you could just take a couple seconds to answer these 2 questions. Yes, okay, it looks like people are seeing them. I see some answers starting to come in. Thank you so much for your feedback. And yes, if you don't have any further questions, feel free to hop off. You'll be getting an email from Carolyn in the coming days with all of the info you need. I'll leave that up for a minute. Thank you all so much for joining. Let's see. Small creatures attacking asparagus. Feel free to unmute, John. What do they look like?
Well, they're like very small. They're pretty little beetles, and they attack the tips. And I don't know if eventually the asparagus shoots will start to curl after a while.
Okay, and I think it kind of missed you in the beginning there. You said small beetles.
Well, very small beetles, yes, kind of colorful.
Okay. And they didn't look like flea beetles.
No. I was thinking maybe potato beetles or something.
Yep, possibly a potato beetle. They're kind of round looking.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to. I've tried Safer soap, and it keeps them off for a while. But the minute it rains, you have to go out and do it again because it doesn't. They come right back.
Yeah,
and it only happens when the weather starts warming up.
Okay. I'm just doing a little thing. There's actually a beetle called the common asparagus beetle that looks a lot like the potato beetle. Okay. I'm thinking that could be it. Let me see what we're recommending for. Yep, active in spring when the shoots begin to emerge. That's sounding pretty like what you are describing. So what we recommend, I guess, is hand picking, which can be problematic because, like you said, you need to do it like often because they keep coming back. Any good cleanup this this fall is going to be good. Let's see here. Let's see here if we have a product we're recommending. So you'll want to make sure asparagus is listed and just kind of maybe like a very general vegetable garden safe product, like maybe 7, something with a good short pre-harvest interval could work on those.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion, I guess. And yeah, if you see get a chance to get a good picture of them, just go ahead and shoot it over to me and we'll make sure.
Will do. They've already started here, so.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you can feel free to shoot me a photo and we can make sure that that's what you're dealing with. But I think that sounds kind of likely. Okay, let me pull up the chat one more time. All right, I think we got them all. Thank you, everybody, for joining.